the separation of church and state is a misnomer. People misunderstand it. Of course, it comes from a phrase that was in a letter that Jefferson wrote. It's not in the Constitution. And what he was explaining is they did not want the government to encroach upon the church.
That was Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson. Johnson had been Speaker of the House just a few minutes when I wrote on my blog on October 25th, 2023, that he was a fan of Christian Nation storyteller David Barton. In the weeks after his election, Johnson was frequently asked about his views on faith and politics. On one such occasion, journalist Andrew Sorkin asked the Speaker what the separation of church and state meant to him. Sorkin began by pointing out that Johnson had, on the day he was sworn in, prayed, quote, on the floor of Congress with a number of other congressmen, end quote. Sorkin then asked, quote, and there is a question about the separation of church and state. But how do you think about that? And how do you think about the public perception of that, end quote. Johnson's answer reflected a Christian nationalist diminishment of the separation of church and state, calling it a, quote, misnomer, end quote. Listen to Johnson.
Listen, faith, our deep religious heritage and tradition, is a big part of what it means to be an American. When the founders set this system up, they wanted a vibrant expression of faith in the public square because they believed that a general moral consensus and virtue was necessary to maintain this grand experiment in self-governance that we created, a government of, by, and for the people. We don't have a king in charge. We don't have a middleman. So we've got to keep morality amongst us so that we have accountability. And so they wanted faith to be a big part of that. The separation of church and state is a misnomer. People misunderstand it. Of course, it comes from a phrase that was in a letter that Jefferson wrote. It's not in the Constitution. And what he was explaining is they did not want the government to encroach upon the church, not that they didn't want principles of faith to have influence on our public life. It was exactly the opposite. Washington said, of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. And John Adams came next and he said, our Constitution is made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. They knew that it would be important to maintain our system. And that's why I think we need more of that. Not an establishment of any national religion, but we need everybody's vibrant expression of faith because it's such an important part of who we are as a nation.
Speaker Johnson is correct that the phrase separation of church and state was used by Jefferson in a letter to Baptist ministers in Danbury, Connecticut. The phrase verbatim is not in the Constitution, although, as we shall see, the sentiment certainly is. But is he correct that the phrase is a misnomer? Many Christian nationalists go further than Johnson and call separation of church and state a myth. Did the founders want to separate church and state, or did they intend for the wall to protect only the church from the government? In my new book, The Christian Past That Wasn't, I argue that the founders intended to separate church and state when they crafted the governing documents. While there were many religious influences leading up to the formation of the charter documents, the fact remains that when those documents were crafted and ratified, the result was a government separating, not wedding, church and state. Leading up to this segment, we have seen that the colonies prior to independence mostly followed the lead of Mother England and enacted religious establishments. We also saw that the founders as a group had respect for religion in public life, and many of them were orthodox in their Christian beliefs. No matter what religious beliefs the founders held, a better test of the sentiment of the founders regarding their intentions for the new nation is what they did when they came together to establish a new system of government. In this segment, which roughly tracks with Chapter 6 in the book, I focus on reasons to believe church and state separation is the American way. To help with this task, I am bringing back a bonus episode from Season 1 featuring Dartmouth University Professor of Religion Randall Balmer. Randall is a friend, supporter of the podcast, and endorser of The Christian Past That Wasn't. In this segment, he walks us through several reasons why he believes the founders intended separation of church and state to be the proper system.
I think the whole argument that the United States is and always has been a Christian nation falters on three grounds. First of all, the First Amendment itself, which prohibits the establishment of religion. Second, the founders, none of whom, with the possible exception of John Witherspoon, president of the College of New Jersey, and Benjamin Rush, a physician, none of the founders would be welcome as members in any of the churches who are now propagating Christian nationalism. But we also have to contend with the Treaty of Tripoli. The Treaty of Tripoli was negotiated at the end of George Washington's administration. It was sent to the Senate by John Adams with an endorsement. It was read aloud before the U.S. Senate and ratified unanimously on June 7th, 1797. Article 11 of the Treaty of Tripoli reads, "The United States is in no sense founded on the Christian religion." That's pretty explicit. The entire Senate unanimously ratified the Treaty of Tripoli in 1797, saying that the United States is not a Christian nation.
The Treaty of Tripoli was negotiated with the leaders of the Tripoli region of what is now Libya in northern Africa in order to neutralize threat to American ships subject to piracy in the Mediterranean. The specific reason the Christian nation clause was added is not clear from the record, but may have been to minimize perception of religious conflict with Muslim nations. While it is not clear when the clause was added, it was ratified on June 7, 1797, by the Senate and signed by John Adams 3 days later, on June 10th, as described by Dr. Balmer.
Throughout American history, there have been various attempts to anoint the United States as a Christian nation because, of course, the charter documents do not do so. And probably the best example of that took place during the Civil War. One of the Confederacy's complaints about the Union or against the Union was that the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, did not specifically acknowledge Christianity as being the formation or the foundation of the United States. And so there was a movement after the Confederacy declared itself to be a Christian entity called the National Reform Association that sought to amend the Constitution so that the United States would explicitly be a Christian nation. A delegation of these folks visited Abraham Lincoln and made their case before the president. And Lincoln, in his wisdom, temporized. He said, in effect, well, let me think about this. And apparently never got back to them, and it went nowhere. But that's been one of the attempts, one of several attempts. Most recently in the 1960s, after the school prayer decisions by the Supreme Court, there was another attempt to amend the Constitution to designate the United States as a Christian nation, and it even has the support of Everett Dirksen, the venerable Republican senator from Illinois, who proclaimed that he was positively evangelistic about this effort to make the United States into a Christian nation. Fortunately, both for the faith and for the Republic, wiser heads have prevailed in each of these attempts to amend the Constitution.
Thanks to Randall Balmer for his perspective. In Chapter 6, I cover this ground and more. In addition, I talk about the Articles of Confederation, the letter to the Danbury Baptists from Thomas Jefferson, the Church of the Holy Trinity versus the United States, which is a Supreme Court case Christian nationalists often use as a trump card for their side. Finally, I refer to James Madison as a champion of separation of church and state. Many Christian nationalists try to isolate Thomas Jefferson as the only founder who wanted church and state to be separate, and make him the exception. While the founders differed in their beliefs about the subject, Jefferson was not alone. James Madison also believed mixing church and state was unacceptable and unhealthy in many ways. In his detached memoranda, Madison criticized presidential proclamations of thanksgiving and prayer. According to Madison, religious proclamations encourage the false notion of a national religion, the very thing the First Amendment prohibits. Madison had very definite ideas about separation of church and state. For his part, Madison wanted a perfect separation. Listen to what he said to Louisiana politician Edward Livingston. Quote, "Every new and successful example, therefore, of a perfect separation between the ecclesiastical and civil matters is of importance, and I have no doubt that every new example will succeed, as every past one has done, in showing that religion and government will both exist in greater purity the less they are mixed together." End quote. Coming back to Jefferson, he saw that separation of church and state was good for both state and church. For instance, he rightly believed coercion was inherent in governmental action linking religion and government. To Samuel Miller, he said about government prayer and thanksgiving proclamations, quote, "It is only proposed that I should recommend, not prescribe a day of fasting and prayer. That is, that I should indirectly assume to the United States an authority over religious exercises which the Constitution has directly precluded them from. It must be meant, too, that this recommendation is to carry some authority, and to be sanctioned by some penalty on those who disregard it, not indeed of fine and imprisonment, but of some degree of proscription, perhaps in public opinion. And does the change in the nature of the penalty make the recommendation the less a law of conduct for those to whom it is directed? I do not believe it is for the interest of religion to invite the civil magistrate to direct its exercises, its discipline, or its doctrines, nor of the religious societies that the general government should be invested with the power of effecting any uniformity of time or matter among them. Fasting and prayer are religious exercises, the enjoining them an act of discipline. Every religious society has a right to determine for itself the time for these exercises and the objects proper for them according to their own particular tenets, and this right can never be safer than in their own hands, where the Constitution has deposited it." End quote. Jefferson asserted that presidential power, even to recommend a certain kind of religious exercise, gives it a social authority that can be coercive. Jefferson takes the perspective of those who decide not to obey a recommendation to fast and pray. History shows that nonconformists and dissenters often face persecution. Even if there is no fine or imprisonment from the government, non-participants often face social stigma they would not experience if the government had not interfered in religion. Although subtle, a presidential proclamation is a form of meddling, and the civil magistrate has no business recommending one religious practice over another. We are back on track for weekly segments until the final episode on July 14th. Next week, I examine claims about the charter documents with some interesting material about the Declaration of Independence just in time for the Independence Day holiday. You won't want to miss that. Thanks to Randall Balmer for his work championing what he calls America's best idea, the separation of church and state. See the show notes today for the music credits and for a playlist of the podcast music. If you like the podcast, please tell your friends, and as always, thanks for listening.